Good afternoon and welcome to the November, whatever it is, 29th Council Work Session. And we are honored today to have two guests visiting, and I will turn it over to the manager.
Thank you, Mayor. I'll let Christy say a few remarks as a way of introduction, then I'll probably say a couple of things right after that. So.
Okay. Mayor, Council, thanks for having us here today. We're really excited to come back and talk about some of the exciting things and work that's happening with related to community justice. For nearly the last 3 years, a team of municipal justice stakeholders have been working collaboratively to assess challenges and opportunities to better serve the community. The team has implemented strategies to improve the efficiency of the current system and initiated pilot programs that you're familiar with, such as the court, the community outreach response team, and the community court. Last spring, the city manager informed council that he had tasked this team with doing a system gap assessment. The assessment includes review of the critical needs for the core system, what we need to stabilize the existing system that we have, and evaluations of opportunities to continue advancing in community-based system approaches. The team is in the process of completing this assessment and has contracted with 21st Century Policing Solutions to assist with our evaluation. A council work session will be scheduled in January to update you more fully on the work that's been done. The purpose of our meeting today is to provide you with an opportunity to learn more about 21st century policing philosophies and the 6 core pillars established by the team. Today we are joined by 2 members of the President Obama's task force that was formed in 2014, tasked with working on 21st century policing strategies, and you'll hear a lot more about the work that they've done. So we're joined by former Police Commissioner of Philadelphia, Chuck Ramsey, and Sean Smoot. Mr. Ramsey has nearly 50 years of law enforcement experience. He's retired in 2015 from his position as Police Commissioner of Philadelphia, and it's worth noting that Philadelphia is the 4th largest city in the country, and lots of positive things that were happening there under his service. He was also the police chief for Washington, D.C. and the deputy superintendent in the Chicago department. He is nationally recognized for being at the forefront of developing innovative policing strategies, evidence-based initiatives, organizational accountability, and neighborhood-based programs. Mr. Smoot serves as the Director and Chief Counsel to the Police Benevolent and Protective Association of Illinois and the Benevolent Labor Committee. He is the elected Treasurer of the National Association of Police Organization, a law enforcement advocacy group that represents over 250,000 officers across the country. From 2008 to 2014, he was a member of the Executive Session on Police and Public Safety at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. So quite distinguished people that we have here today that are helping us. Mr. Ramsey and Mr. Smoot are both working with the City of Eugene to assist the city in assessing its community justice strategies that support practices and philosophies that are in alignment with these best practices nationwide. And last night, they did a presentation. We invited members from the Human Rights Commission, the Police Commission, and the Civilian Review Board, as well as interested community members to hear their presentation last night. So today, it's your turn to hear from them. There'll be an opportunity. They'll run through their presentation. It'll be an opportunity for you to ask questions. And with that, John, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Christy. Just a couple of thoughts. This is a really important conversation, partly as Christy's mentioned, as we think about community justice in the broad sense, and we'll be bringing more of that information back. But I think you also know, as we recruit for a new police chief, one of the things that we are looking for in that new police chief is to be able to continue the momentum that Chief Kearns really has started already down this road of 21st century policing. And so part of a new chief for us will include their ability to continue this work. And so this intersects for a couple of things for us right now. So it's a good conversation. You're going to hear a lot more about this as we move through the next several months and years. So this is a good base and grounding for that. So
With that, I'll just turn it over to Sean and Chuck.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be before you, Madam Mayor, members of the council. On behalf of 21st Century Policing Solutions, it's been a real privilege for us to work with the city manager, with Ms. Hammond and your city executive staff, as we have for the past several months. Clearly, the city of Eugene has a real interest in improving its community justice programs and its police department, and it's a real honor for us to be able to work with you towards those goals. Just by way of kind of introduction to us, our company was founded in December of 2015. We have 4 principal consultants, myself, Commissioner Ramsey, Chief Roberto Villasenor, who's recently retired Chief of Police from Tucson, Arizona, and Director Ron Davis, who recently retired as the Director of the Cops Office at the U.S. Department of Justice. We also have several associate consultants that work with us. They come from not only the world of law enforcement, but also the world of academia, and some are actually in both worlds, and provide a lot of different services to communities across the country. I have a representative list of our associate consultants, and I would just note for your information, Professor Annette Sicca from the University of Illinois has been assisting us in providing some of the work that we're doing with your improvement committee. Let me just give you a little bit of background about the task force report. I don't know how familiar you all are with the report itself or what its origins are. I think it's probably no surprise, and it certainly wasn't a surprise to us in 2014 when the president decided to put together a task force to address issues in policing based on a lot of very high-profile incidents that occurred around the United States. Those of us who've worked in law enforcement for many years saw some very disturbing trends coming, and I think events in Ferguson, Missouri especially, but also in places like Baltimore and other places since then have really put a spotlight on some of the fractures and frankly weakness in community and police relationships. And so we were tasked by the president to bring forward to him a set of very practical recommendations and action items. Our primary task was to give him recommendations on how police could build better relationships with communities that they serve while continuing to keep crime at a record low. And for all of the bad publicity that is occurring around the country now with regard to crime statistics, the fact of the matter is crime really is at a historical low. While different cities and particular urban areas are seeing some spikes in the last 18 to 24 months, nationally, crime is at an all-time low. And so, excuse me, I'm fighting a little bit of a somewhat winter cold, and if we ever have winter, maybe the cold viruses will go away. But at any rate, when the president impaneled the task force, we had listening sessions across the country. We started in Washington, D.C. We had listening sessions in Cincinnati, Phoenix, back to Washington, D.C. And we really took a great deal of oral testimony, live witness testimony. All of that, by the way, is available online if you have insomnia or something like that and you want to go through and watch hours and hours of it. It is available on C-SPAN, and I believe it's also linked on the DOJ's website. We heard from 132 live witnesses and received over 30,000 pages of written testimony as well. And those are the things that informed us. And the result of that work is in the task force report. I would just mention a couple of caveats about the task force report for those of you who have read it. While we believe, and I think the president indicated that we did satisfy him in terms of meeting our charge, there are things that we were not able to address. And so I would just caution, and I think we all, as members of the task force, caution, we had a very tight timetable. The president appointed us towards the end of December in 2014. Our draft report went to his desk. We presented it to him personally on March 3rd. And bearing in mind between December 18th and March 3rd, there were some pretty significant holidays that occurred, and that our work really wasn't able to begin until after January 1st, 2015. So somebody on the task force did a calculation at one point and determined that we really had what had started out as being maybe a 6-month window was reduced to about a 3-month window, and in reality we had about 57 days in which, from the time we started meeting to the time that our report was presented. I just mentioned that to you, to make you feel a little bit sorry for us, because that's literally all we could do for those 57 days was work on this and travel around the country. But really more importantly, and the real reason that I mention it to you is just to point out that there are a number of things, and we note this at the beginning of the report when we make our first overarching recommendation, that we felt that the president should create a commission to review the entire justice system, soup to nuts. And that hasn't been done since the 1960s, when Lyndon B. Johnson was president. And so while this task force report is probably one of the most solid and useful reports on policing and the status of policing and moving policing forward, it is by no means the beginning and the ending. We fully intended that it would be kind of a seed, and that seed would be planted, and it is being planted across the country by departments like the Eugene Police Department, but that it would also grow and be a living kind of a report that would be added to. So there are a number of things that we weren't able to address because of the time limitation that we were under and because of the limited scope of what we were asked to do. And so I just mentioned that to you because just because something is not in the task force report, that doesn't mean it's not a good idea. And so we have continued the work and are continuing the work here and around the country as principals, and we actually have, as part of our associate consultant group, I believe we have 7 of the 11 task force members are involved in doing this work now with us across the country. So having said that, I'll move on to the report and kind of give you a foundation of what it's all about. And feel free to jump in at any time, Commissioner, and trust me, he will. So first of all, just in terms of the report itself, it's broken down into 6 sections we call 6 pillars. The pillars actually build on each other. And so the first pillar is building trust and legitimacy. And that really provides the basis for the rest of the report. You will see many themes dealing with transparency, accountability, police legitimacy throughout this first part of the report. And a key topic and a key concept, which is procedural justice. And let me just get into that in a little bit more detail because it's probably the most important idea in the task force report itself. What is procedural justice? It's the idea that police are judged by encounters that they have with members of the community on the process of the encounter, not necessarily on the outcome. So, for instance, we were presented with some very legitimate research on people who were surveyed after they had had some type of an encounter with law enforcement officers. And what the research showed was that people really cared more about the way that encounter occurred and how they felt than whether or not it resulted in an enforcement activity. And so, as an example, people were asked who had been stopped for a traffic violation. And regardless of the outcome, some people got citations, some people didn't. It didn't really matter. What mattered to them was how they felt at the end of the stop. If they felt that they had voice in the stop, in the encounter with the officer, if they felt they were treated fairly, if they felt that the officer had a valid reason for stopping them in the first place. And so what that really kind of showed us was what officers are judged by is really, and what people take away from those encounters are the human interaction that they have with the officers. It really didn't matter if they got it you would think, at least I would have thought, more people who received a citation would have had a more negative outlook on that encounter. The fact of the matter is, citation or not really had no bearing on whether they viewed the police as acting legitimately or with procedural justice. It was really how they were treated on the stop, how the officer talked to them, how they were approached. The other part of procedural justice, which is just as important, is the concept of internal procedural justice. And we may circle back and talk about this when we talk about officer safety and wellness, but some other research that we were provided indicated that, again, a survey was done of police officers, and they were asked to identify what stressors were involved in their lives and their work. And the number one source of stress identified by officers themselves wasn't the things that you might assume. It didn't have to do with dealing with violent offenders. It didn't have to do with approaching cars at night. It didn't have to do with use of force or challenges in marriage or anything else. The number one cited stressor by officers was they felt that their employer would not treat them fairly if they made an honest mistake. And that, was very eye-opening for those of us who served on the task force task force itself. Again, this gets back to this notion of procedural justice, and officers, just like citizens, need to feel that they have a voice in their employment situation. They need to feel that they will be treated fairly, that there's a fair review process if they're accused of doing something improper, and that they'll be treated fairly and impartially if they make a mistake. And so, again, the research shows it's not really realistic to expect police officers who don't feel that they will have that to then go out and treat citizens in a way that's inconsistent with what they experience at work. And so these two things, the internal and external procedural justice, are kind of the roots within the task force report itself. I'll kind of let Chuck maybe talk a little bit about some of the things that we recommended departments could do to improve trust and legitimacy in the relationship with members of the community.
Well, first of all, it's really an honor to be here with all of you this afternoon. Sean already mentioned, and you saw on that first slide, or one of the first slides, the 6 pillars that we had identified. They were in no particular order with the exception of the first, and that is building trust and legitimacy, because our feeling was without that, nothing else really works. And that's just a reality. So that's why we addressed that issue first. Sean also mentioned that we had a limited amount of time to put things together. So issues in retrospect like hiring, retention, staffing, I mean, these are critically important issues, but we weren't able to really address those. Our feeling was initially that we would do this basic report, but then we could build on it later with different areas that would come up where we could really take a deeper dive. And even in some of the pillars that we have, we were able to deal with some issues, but it would have been good to be able to revisit them and go just a little bit deeper. But building trust and legitimacy is obviously a major issue, which is fundamental to why the task force was even formed, because clearly policing across the country was under fire and quite frankly, with legitimate reason. And so when we tackled this particular issue, one of the task force members, Sue Rohr, who is from King County in Washington State, she was a sheriff up there, but now I think she heads their training up there in Washington State. She came up with this whole notion of the guardian versus warrior mindset for police officers. We could have probably gone into a little more detail around that, but we really are looking for police officers to have a mindset, and they see themselves as not only protecting people from crime and disorder, but also protecting constitutional rights of people. I and we all take oaths, and within that oath, it's to uphold the Constitution. And when you ask the average police officer what their role is in a democratic society, they'll talk about enforcing laws, they'll talk about a lot of things, but rarely will they mention what I think is the most important of all, and that is protecting people's rights. And so understanding that we are there to protect more than just, their physical well-being and property is very important. And that's why I think this is an important point with the guardian mindset. One of my deputies, when I was in Philadelphia, I think put it very well. He said, when it comes to recruiting and trying to get the right kind of person into the profession, he said we need people with the mindset of a guardian, but really with the heart of a warrior. Because you do have to chase people down alleys that have guns. You do have to stand up for what's right. That takes a particular kind of courage, other than what we normally recognize as being courage. You get knocked down, you got to be able to get back up, and in a lot of different ways. So it's really not as simple as an either-or proposition. You need a little bit of both. Sean already dealt with the issue of procedural justice. But also this whole notion of transparency and accountability. I mean, that's critically important. I've been in policing a long time, 47 years as an active member, and policing traditionally has been very closed and not really open to outside scrutiny. Well, there has to be transparency. Police have to be held accountable. The role we play is far too important for it to be any other way. Now, how you go about achieving that, of course, is different. It depends. There are a lot of different ways in which you can achieve that, and we'll get into that when we get into policy, and oversight is one of the ways in which we can do that. But it's a step toward really kind of getting the kind of public trust that we need in order to be successful. The second pillar actually deals with the issue of policy and oversight. It does kind of build on the first one, and you'll start to see all these things are really interconnected. But we start talking about the role of community in policing and oversight, which is something that, a lot of police leaders take a little bit of a deep breath when they hear the word oversight. We were very clear in our report that there needed to be some form of oversight, civilian oversight of police. Now, what we didn't do was get into what that ought to look like, because that needs to be determined by each jurisdiction as to what that looks like. There is no one model that's necessarily better than another. You could point to some that have been successful, you point to some that haven't been so successful, but the bottom line is having some kind of oversight is something we felt pretty strongly about, and it was included in the report. Policy, having clear policy, as it relates to different areas of operation. I'll use of force as an example, coupled with training. Again, critically important. But this is where oversight can also play a role, even in policy. Mayor Nutter, who I work for in Philadelphia, decided to create a civilian oversight group when we became involved in our department with something called collaborative reform, which is just short of a consent decree, but it does help you a great deal in terms of making some changes internally within your department. And so we were in the middle of revising our use of force policies in the Philadelphia Police Department. And so I sent the draft policy to the oversight group for their review before we printed the policy. Well, like in any other profession, you get used when you're communicating with one another. Certain language and the way in which you express things, you expect the people within the organization to understand what it is you're talking about. But when outside people take a look at it, they look at it and they say, this isn't clear. What do you mean by this? What do you mean by that? And we started getting that kind of feedback. And we incorporated that feedback into our policy. And our policy was a lot stronger and a lot clearer as a result of that. And so just having that third-party review of training, of policy development, of things of that nature can actually add value within the department. And again, transparency, I think, is very important. If you go to phillypolice.com, all the directives are right online, all the police policies, procedures, and so forth. Again, that's something that came directly from policy and oversight. The other, and I'll go right into pillar 3 and then turn it back over to you for Sean, because we want to kind of go through this fairly quickly so we leave enough time for questions. We dealt with technology and social media. Now, social media clearly has changed the landscape of everything in America. I mean, information flows so quickly in almost real time. Some of that information is accurate, some of that information is not accurate, but you still got to deal with it. It doesn't matter any longer where something takes place. You'll feel the effects of it in your own jurisdiction. A good example of that is Ferguson, Missouri. Now, I grew up in Chicago, and I had relatives in St. Louis, and we used to go to St. Louis all the time. I had never heard of Ferguson, Missouri. I had to get a map to figure out where is Ferguson. I had no idea. I think everybody knows now. But who would have thought that a city of 50,000 people with roughly 50 police officers would actually change policing in America? Yet it did. So it doesn't matter if you're a small city with a small department, medium size, large, it doesn't matter. What happens one place affects us elsewhere, and a lot of that is due to social media. We also learn the importance of police departments and cities being very aggressive when it comes to getting their own information out, using social media as a platform, not just relying on mainstream media. Good example of that, the Boston bombing, for example. It was a major news network, CNN, that reported that the suspects were in custody. Well, that wasn't accurate. But they were able to, in Boston, put information out very quickly to correct that, to keep people who remain vigilant because the bombers had not been caught. Had it not been for social media, people watching CNN, how long would it have taken before people would have realized that, no, the threat is still very much there? So social media is very important. But in the area of technology, there were some people that were disappointed that we didn't spend a lot of time talking about body cameras. Well, we didn't spend a lot of time talking about body cameras simply because that happened to be the piece of technology that everybody was talking about at the moment. And we didn't want to just date the report because there are much broader issues here. Today it's body cameras. Tomorrow is going to be some other piece of technology that we want to use in law enforcement, and which raises a lot of different issues. Mostly constitutional issues. And so we wanted to focus the discussion on that. Technology is great. We need to be able to use technology, but we need to do it within a constitutional framework. And so we have to be very careful as we develop policies, as we decide to use technology, that we have these conversations up front. We need the ACLU, we need the Bar Association, we need community members, civil rights advocates, police officials, others to sit down and talk about this stuff up front before something happens that now the courts are going to take over and they'll make the decisions for you. And so, you talk about drones, the use of drones, for an example, in policing. I can see where there are going to be some cases where a drone would be very valuable. But does that not have an impact on Fourth Amendment, for an example, in some situations? I can just see the kind of situations that can develop where we'll have problems. A lot of departments use license plate readers, devices. You go down the street and it's scanning tags. It's great. You recover a lot of stolen cars. You get people that stole the cars. What happens when your manufacturer decides to say, okay, I'm going to put facial recognition software on these things. And instead of scanning license tags, now you're scanning faces of everybody you're driving down the street, and you're scanning the faces. They may be in a public place, and we can argue that. The point is, just because you can do something doesn't necessarily mean you should do it. And you need to have careful, thoughtful discussion up front before there's abuses. It's easy to get in a database. It's not that easy to get out of it. And so we want to make sure that we protect the rights of individuals as we begin to use technology. It goes back to Pillar 2 with policy, that we have solid policies in place that restrict the use of it and have safeguards to make sure that it's not being abused. So we wanted to kind of deal with that broader issue as opposed to just looking at the piece of technology that at the moment was getting all the attention. The next pillar 4 is community policing and crime reduction. Sean, you want to
Sure.
jump in that one.
So one of the themes that you'll see kind of run through this, and we'll cover this in the conclusionary kind of wrap up of our presentation, but is this idea of co-production, that it's not just the police's responsibility to create public safety. It has to be co-produced by not just the police, but also the community itself. And so in the fourth pillar, we really look at how the community can be involved in crime-reducing strategies. And also, we note that it's really important to analyze what impact certain tactics will have on communities and on certain segments of community members. We also really emphasize a lot in the community policing pillar interaction with youth. One of the things that we became very acutely aware of is the fact that because of in some senses maybe technology, but also just because of demographics and shifts in people's priorities, it's very difficult to get youth engaged. And particularly people of the young adult, late teen years, to get engaged in as a group in the community with the police. And so, we really call for significant partnerships amongst not only police agencies, but with the schools and social services, and particularly social service agencies that are serving the youth. In terms of the co-production of public safety, the real theme to this pillar is that it's really everyone's job. When you work with residents to help them, to have them actually help you as a police agency identify what problems are and identify potential solutions to those problems, you really create an ownership opportunity for the community in terms of creating public safety. And I think it's important also to keep in mind that it really is the community that defines public safety. And in terms of, and what I mean by that is, depending on where you live, your idea of public safety could be totally different than somebody who lives someplace else. So, where I live, the idea of public safety might be, do you feel comfortable with your 12-year-old son going across the street and playing in the park by himself? Where some other people live, it might be, the idea of public safety might be, can I walk across the street without getting shot? And so I know those are two very significantly different perceptions, but they're real. And so the community really does kind of define, and it can be defined as finitely as a neighborhood or a certain section of a block in a neighborhood as to what public safety means. And so it's really important for police agencies to engage with the community, to determine what that means in that community, so that they can serve and protect that community in a way that's consistent with the community's values. We talk about in the report, and frankly, your police department does a number of these things. You have a very, I think, progressive chief. It's done a very, very good job. So when we've gone through a number of these things with them, they can come up with some pretty good examples of ways that they've implemented some of these recommendations. So I want to throw that out there for you. But in terms of the culture of a department, I think one of the things that we talk about that's essential to community policing is to actually have the department's culture be built around it, and be built around this idea of engaging with community members and having them involved at every step, not only in the co-production of public safety out in the community, but also in the production of policing. And I understand you have a civilian review board. We met with a number of people from your police commission last night and had some very good discussions and question and answer sessions with them. So I'm very encouraged by what I see here in terms of the community policing philosophy, And it seems to me that there's a significant commitment on the part of the city and the city's police department to move that forward. So I commend you on that. I'm going to move on. And I probably should have said this to start with, by the way. We're happy to answer questions along the way if anybody has one. We intend to get through our presentation in the next maybe 15 minutes, and we've left a lot of time to get questions. But if you have a question, don't hesitate to interrupt us, particularly me, a lawyer by training, so I'll just keep talking if you don't interrupt me at some point. Pillar 5, training and education. Do you want to take a first?
Sure. Training and education is obviously a very important part of this. I mean, policy development is one thing. Training officers on that policy is a totally different issue. But the kind of training that takes place is changing in policing. For an example, fair and impartial policing, which is identifies the biases that exist, and we all have them in some manner, shape, or form. But how do you conduct yourself? How do you recognize it, and then conduct yourself in a way in which it doesn't interfere with your ability to do your job and the decisions that you make? There are various academic institutions that put on this training, private providers that put on this kind of training. But that is now essential training for police. The other is scenario-based training, where some call it reality-based training, where rather than have, people just talk at you trying to explain a policy, you actually create scenarios in which officers have to exercise judgment, and you challenge them on that judgment. And let me give you one example of just how training has changed in my old department. Obviously, part of basic training involves how to make a felony car stop, how to position your vehicle, how to approach a vehicle, all these kinds of things, right, which is very important for the safety of the officer, safety of the occupants in a car. But we added an extra feature to that, because the scenario is one where there's a blue Chevy that two suspects that just robbed a convenience store, jumped into this vehicle and took off heading, south down a particular street. Well, 2 blocks from the scene, a couple cops see a blue Chevy going in that direction, occupied twice. They pull it over. So you got trainers making sure they make a stop properly and so forth. But then the scenario changes because this isn't the right car. It was a different blue Chevy. That's not the one that was in the in the lookout. And so now how do you handle that? Because the driver's irate. He's upset because he's been stopped. And so there's another trainer now whose sole job it is to listen to the officer and the interaction with the driver and how well they're able to de-escalate the situation. Okay? And because de-escalation now is a big piece of the police training. So little tweaks to an existing scenario can make a huge difference in terms of being able to challenge officers and how they approach, how they talk to people, all these kinds of things. Because my experience has been it's not as much the fact that a person is stopped as how they're treated during a stop. That usually is the source of most complaints. If they're treated in a disrespectful fashion, that means more to people, and for a very good reason, than the stop itself. So training has changed. Education is another feature. Many departments have had educational programs for police officers, sending them back to school and things of that nature, but that's not what we're talking about here. To get a better understanding of the role of police in a democratic society, our officers need to be educated about the history of policing in the United States. We're hiring 20-year-olds, 21-year-olds that their view of the world is limited because of their age. I mean, I lived through the Civil Rights era, for an example. For them, it's something in a history book that they may or may not have paid a whole lot of attention to. I'll give you an example of a program we started in Philly. The National Constitution Center is located in Philadelphia. And I remember stopping by one day just to see exactly, what they did. Was it just a museum where you went in and you just looked at a lot of stuff and walked out, or is there actual educational programs? Well, there are educational programs in there. And they pretty much traced the evolution of democracy from 1776 to the current date. And I asked them, I said, well, could you take a look and take snapshots of policing during that same period of time here in the United States? Well, 1776, you didn't have organized police forces, but maybe you were working on a plantation and your job was to chase down slaves. That's a police-like function. When you think about Bloody Sunday, or later became known as Bloody Sunday, when protesters coming across the bridge during the Civil Rights era, who's waiting for them on the other side? Police. And so the point of that is that the history of policing in the United States has not been that positive. And that sticks to a lot of people, and it sticks with a lot of people. And so you wonder why there's more tension in one community versus another, say African-American community versus another community. A lot of it has to do with the history, and you need to understand that, because you can't move forward and build bridges unless you know where you came from. And so understanding that, I think, is essential for police officers because of the critical nature of the role that they play. There are other programs that I know exist in different cities where those kinds of discussions are beginning to take place. But I think it's healthy. I think it's good. I think it's something that people need to know, and they need to understand if we're going to move forward. So that's the educational component that we focused on. Something near and dear to my partner's heart here, officer safety and wellness. I'll let you jump into that one, and then we'll conclude.
Sure. So the final pillar, and we kind of decided that this would be the right bookend pillar from the start of the task force report, Pillar 1, to have it end, to have the last pillar be officer wellness and safety. And we really looked at all aspects of officer safety, including their mental and physical well-being. And what I mean by all aspects, we talked about ballistic vests, using seat belts. The fact of the matter is the majority of officers who are injured or killed in the line of duty every year, a majority of those officers are killed because of traffic accidents, not because of being shot. And that's a statistic you can look up, but it's a fact, and that's been the fact for several years. And so something as simple as wearing a seatbelt can actually save a number of officers' lives. And there are a number of reasons they don't wear them. One of them being a lot of times the cars that are manufactured and the seatbelts that are put in by the manufacturers are not designed to fit around somebody who's wearing a lot of equipment on their belt, and a ballistic vest and the other things, and the radio and things that can get hung up in a seatbelt. And so we talk about that, and we talk about the need for the industry to adapt restraint devices that are actually made to work with what police officers universally carry and wear as part of their duties. We also talked about the idea of having officers actually involved in testing. When a department is going to use a new piece of equipment or a new tool or a new car, and have officers actually involved in that decision-making process with the department, with the city, so that they can actually trial it. And we actually talk a lot about both this in the context of new technology, but also in the context of new equipment. That department should have a policy and a procedure that includes a trial period so that they can identify issues that may come up as part of using that equipment. And may cause a safety issue for officers or for citizens. And then some of the other areas that we really delved into had to deal not only with officers' physical well-being, but with their mental health. And policing is a very challenging profession, and unfortunately, the statistics show that there's a very high divorce rate amongst police officers when compared with other professions. There's a very high rate of alcohol abuse or alcoholism. There's unfortunately and tragically a very high suicide rate in the profession of policing. And many of those things are really tied back into the mental health of the officers, and there are not a lot of resources available for officers to reach out and get help in a confidential manner. So we talk about the importance of that. We also talk about changing the culture in terms of opening up in police departments so that officers feel comfortable seeking out peer assistance, talking about if they're having problems. Policing as a culture is, as Chuck described, pretty kind of insular, and it still remains today a profession that where the folks who seek out to become police officers often have the personality type that they got into this job to help people. They didn't get into this job because they needed help, and they tend to not seek help even when they need it. They also tend not to encourage their peers to seek help, even though they can recognize that there are problems. And so we talked about not only having resources available for them to get the assistance that they need, but also making sure that officers are trained to recognize in themselves and others warning signs in terms of behavior that's risky, use of alcohol or drugs, depression, and those types of things. Excuse me. And then, we kind of wrap this up by encouraging departments to adopt a philosophy that where the organization itself, the entire department, is really focused on health, wellness, and safety. And so that people have the opportunity, if they see a situation that's unsafe, they have that voice, again, getting back to procedural justice, and they feel like they can point out a situation that makes them feel unsafe or a piece of equipment that makes them feel unsafe, and their supervisor will actually take that seriously and look into it and see if there's a better way to do things or a better tool to use. So, again, this is really about opening up communication within the department. And inclusion of rank and file officers, the people who actually use the tools and equipment, having the opportunity to have a voice in decisions that are made about them, and creating a healthy work environment and a healthy environment for officers who need assistance to recognize that need and to seek it without feeling that they'll be in some way painted or in some way tainted in their career because they felt the need to seek mental health professional assistance. Anything you want to add?
Well, just that, it's unfortunate, but it's also a reality that there's still a stigma associated with getting help, mental health services, and policing is no different. But I think it's important to remember that, police are exposed to a lot of trauma that's it's just not normal to be exposed to. On an ongoing basis. PTSD isn't limited to soldiers coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan. It can happen in policing. One example, I'll give you a couple examples. One, when I was the chief in D.C., I lost one of my young officers due to, the kind of trauma that he experienced. He wasn't able to overcome, and he wound up leaving the department, and to this day it probably haunts him. He responded to about a 3-year veteran of the department responded to a disturbance call. Not knowing what it was, woman opened up a door and handed him a 3-year-old child that she had just decapitated. Oh. She was suffering from mental illness. He's got 3, 4, 5-year-old kids at home. Now, how do you deal with that sort of thing? Obviously, that's unusual even for us, and you provide mental health services. But he left soon after that because it was just too much. I worked in homicide for a lot of years in Chicago, and obviously Chicago has more than a few homicides. You build up defense mechanisms so that you can do your job when you're at the scene, some very violent scenes and so forth. People interpret that as being uncaring, and that, because you're detached and you're not showing any kind of empathy toward the family and so forth. But these are mechanisms that build up over time. But what about somebody who spent 10 years in that unit dealing with it? I mean, how often are we putting them through some kind of counseling and making it mandatory? You just go through counseling because they may not be aware that they have a problem. But maybe they're self-medicating, which is why they drink so much. Maybe they're having some problems at home. Maybe that's why they're having problems at home. We wonder why sometimes cops are rude and disrespectful. A lot of times it's because of the stress that's inherent in the job. And we can never advertise a position in policing as being a stress-free environment because it's not. And you have to be resilient to a point. But we also need to think about the mental health aspect of it. I was police commissioner in Philly for 8 years, and I had 8 police officers killed in the line of duty. 5 shot to death, 3 in auto-related incidents. But 5 of those deaths occurred over a 9-month period. 3 shot to death, 2 auto crashes in 9 months. And 2 months before I took over as police commissioner, we had another officer that had been shot to death when he walked into a convenience store robbery, and the offender shot him to death. That had a tremendous impact on not only the department but on me. We didn't have the internal resources, and I have I had a large department. I mean, there's 6,800 sworn members in the Philadelphia Police Department. So it's a big agency, but we didn't have the kind of support structure to deal with that sort of thing. So we had to partner with the University of Pennsylvania and their behavioral health to put together counseling that I made everybody go through, including myself. Me and the command staff were the first to go through, because the reality is that there is a stigma. So you just, they're not going to raise their hand and say, I need to go. So we just made everybody go. And so we really do need to pay attention to that as a profession. I'm not talking about Eugene specifically. I'm talking about the profession of policing. We do have to take care of the mental health as well as the physical well-being of our cops.
So just a few overarching themes that you kind of see throughout the report, and I'll just go through these quickly, but it's really all about partnerships and engaging. And so, we identified basically 4 categories of groups of partners or partnerships: community members and leaders, of course. And, we emphasize that a lot of times community leaders, real leaders, can be informal leaders, not necessarily the president of the homeowners association. It might actually be someone else in the community that has real leadership potential. Also, other agencies and organizations. In particular, this is apropos to Eugene. You have some unique issues here, particular with regard to people who have homeless issues and mental health issues, including addiction issues. And as a result of that, your officers interface on a pretty regular basis with other organizations and other agencies in trying to help kind of deal with those problems. Educational institutions, and Chuck's given you a couple of really good examples. One in the scenario you just talked about, where they partnered with Penn and their mental health services. But also, you have a university here, and a lot of police departments partner with community colleges and universities, not just in the sense of partnering with them in an attempt to recruit future employees, but partnering with them to help the departments assess what they're doing and provide them with graduate students to assess things that they're doing and analyze things and judge the efficacy of different programs that they're using. So educational institutions is another really great potential partner. And then, of course, businesses. And so, again, going through, this is all about engagement. This is all about community, engaging the community, but also it's about engaging other resources that you have. For a long time, and still a lot of people feel that public safety is the police's job. It's the job of the police department. And the fact of the matter is, it's all of our jobs. And the police can't do it by themselves. They have to have partners in the community. And those partners can take different forms and shapes. But we've got to have everybody on board in order to create the kind of public safety that our communities want and need. Just to kind of conclude here, this is where we're at. I think hopefully we've given you at least a good picture of the issues that we've identified and some of the recommendations and action items. We're more than happy to answer any questions that you may have or listen to comments that you have, and look forward to continuing our work with the police department and with the city of Eugene to help. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This was very illuminating to me. I really appreciate your report. I have a whole sort of list of trigger points, and I was very interested in your comment at the end, which is that our challenges around homelessness were unique. I thought, because I was going to ask you, like, how unique is that? And then clearly you're suggesting it's unique. So I don't know if you have other ways in which you would, play that out for us about what makes it different in Eugene.
So what makes it different here and compared to other places that we work around the country is the increase that you have had. Early on, one of my first visits to your city, I had a very long discussion with the chief and your executive staff. And one of the things we talked about was the homeless population and what apparently it has increased by almost 100% over the last decade. That kind of exponential increase is unique. I shouldn't say it's totally unique, because Seattle has a very similar issue. Salt Lake City has had similar issues, but nationally, it is unique to have that kind of an increase. And obviously, there's a lot of potential explanations for that, but that's not really my area of expertise, is figuring that out. I can tell you what other cities have done and what other cities are doing around the country in terms of specific programming to assist people who need a home and want a home, people who need help. And there are a number of really good programs out there that are being used. Salt Lake City and Seattle have two of the best, I think. And we've had some discussions about that.
Interesting. Okay, thank you. I won't hijack this completely. I have three counselors in the queue. Counselor Clark first, then Counselor Taylor, then Counselor Evans, and then Pryor. Okay.
Thank you, Mayor. I feel a little less adequate to start this process with you gentlemen. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your presentation. I guess when I hear this and when I read these things, I see my role as trying to understand what 21st century policing is better, so I understand both what the work that you're doing that we appreciate with our police department will produce, as well as helping people that I represent or people in our community understand how policing is and should be evolving in our community and what expectations that brings forward. So I'm intrigued by the issues around legitimacy being foundational, and wonder just some odd questions like, is it possible for an officer to act within policy, within appropriate procedure, and within the law, and outside of legitimacy, in your experience?
Trying to think of specific examples, but I would say that it is a lot of it could be possible, and a lot of that would probably go toward how the interaction takes place, the kind of conversation that takes place. I would argue that if they are acting in a disrespectful way, not treating people in a respectful way or whatever, then they're not operating inside of policy. They're operating outside of policy. But you have to have those policies in place. You have to have accountability systems in place in order to be able to take action against individuals that may act outside of that or right on the edge. It's hard to get inside the head of an individual and whether or not a bias is driving how they interact and what they do and how they go about doing it. There's a saying in policing, for an example, when it comes to officer-involved shootings, that, it could be lawful but awful. In other words, technically, they're within their legal authority to have used deadly force. But the question becomes, did you really have to? Could there something else have been done? Could you have taken a different tactical approach to the given situation? Could you have de-escalated the situation somewhat. It may not have been possible. You might have had the same outcome, but you have to ask those questions. So someone can do something that can technically be lawful, but it's debatable as to whether or not it was really necessary, if that makes sense at all. So it kind of puts you in a position that's really difficult in terms of trying to come up with anything that's a clear violation of policy. But clearly there could have been other options that might have been available had they used them.
Thank you for that. I had the privilege to serve on the police commission for about 9 years, and so I've been involved at least in conversations about policy creation and the wording of which and the expectation of such. For me, it seems like our community has, probably like many, have different opinions on the idea of what legitimate authority is and what they're comfortable with. So if the answer to, and in 21st century policing, if the answer is building partnerships with communities, how do you do that effectively in split communities who are of different minds about what legitimate authority and its exercise is?
Well, I mean, your authority comes from the law, so I mean that gives you legitimacy in a certain sense. But I think when people look at police, the kind of legitimacy we're talking about is what gives you the moral authority to be able to tell me what to do.
Right.
You know, and a lot of that has to do with, and one of the things we emphasize to our officers is something is relatively simple as, you know, parking your police car in a bus stop when you're not on a call for service. Because if the average Joe Blow citizen parks in a bus stop, they're going to get a ticket. So we do a lot of training and education in policing, but the one thing that I think we need to put more focus on is helping officers better understand the power and authority they've been granted by the position that they hold. Again, you're talking about 20, 21-year-olds that all of a sudden they get a badge, a gun, and a souped-up Crown Vic, and then we wonder why things go bad sometimes.
And they're still human, yeah.
And they're human beings, and so you have to take that into account. And it's the little things that build legitimacy within a community, in the eyes of the community, because that same cop that parked in the bus stop when they were having lunch, at some point in time is going to write somebody a ticket for parking illegally, right? And so, you know, you think about that, or park on a meter and don't put a quarter in the meter. And everybody else on the block that's not parked there. Now, we're not talking about being on an emergency call. You're not going to go on an emergency call or robbery in progress, park and then put in and feed the meter. But we're talking about those times, so that's not the case. And so people see that stuff. They may not pay attention, but they see it, and they make note of it. And so that harms, as an organization and as a profession, the legitimacy that we have. And so what gives you the authority then to do X, Y, and Z? Or if we show up to a domestic disturbance involving an officer and his wife, and we don't take action and we don't report it, whereas if the average couple gets involved in that, there'd be some other kind of consequence. So if people get the opinion that, you know, we're hiding stuff, or we're sweeping it under the rug, or we don't take proper action simply because it was a police officer that was involved driving under the influence or something like that. I mean, those are the kinds of things that make a difference. And so that's, I hope that kind of answers the question a little bit.
Does a just procedure, in pillar number 1, that was one of the pieces, was talking about the procedural justice. Is a just procedure one that has officers treat people with equality before the law as a major tenet? Is that a key piece of that?
It is. It really boils down to people being treated fairly and with respect. And to answer your question, like, what do you do if you have a split? I have never seen a split in amongst people in my experience, and I've got a lot of it, but I don't have all of it. So you tell me if I'm wrong here. But I've never had somebody say that they thought it was okay for a police officer to treat someone unfairly and disrespectfully. And so the root analysis in terms of procedural justice and legitimacy is, are people treated fairly and respectfully.
I guess my
If they are,
question.
then
Oh, I'm sorry.
if they are, then that's the first step into the analysis, if that makes sense.
But
It is. My question is really more about the public's spectrum of what is fair and just and respectful treatment. In our community, that's a pretty wide spectrum.
Well, that's
but
a lot of
it is a wide,
communities.
it is a wide spectrum, but it's not about how we think we're treating people. It's about how they perceive they're being treated.
It's about feelings rather than.
To a large extent. If I have a feeling that, I'm being treated in a way that, like I commit a traffic violation and I get a ticket, okay? But then if I have a feeling that if I were maybe an attractive woman, or if I were white, or if I were this, or if I were that, maybe I wouldn't have gotten that ticket. It may not even be legitimate, but if I feel that way, then, because we all have bias of some kind, right? And so if I feel that way, then, why is that? Why do people feel like they're not getting a fair shake? Why do they feel like the city takes care of one neighborhood more than they take care of another neighborhood? Is it because of wealth? Is it because of race? Is it because of whatever? And so, we can give example after example, but the bottom line is you got to deal with the perceptions that exist out there. And some of those perceptions are rooted in real incidents that it may have taken place, may not involving them personally, but exist. And so we can't discount it. We have to deal with it. And our job, and what would be ideal, is the next viral video that hits, that people here in Eugene would look at that, but they would also say, boy, that's terrible, but our cops would never do that. Because the perception of policing here would be such that people had the kind of faith, and the department had the kind of legitimacy, that even if something bad happened, it would be handled in a way that would be right down the line and fair, and the outcome would be one that they could respect because they feel it's legit. And there are many, many cities, and I'm not talking specifically about Eugene. I don't know anything like that here, but I can tell you that in cities I've been in, that feeling that everything's going to be handled in a very straightforward, fair manner, everybody doesn't share that feeling. As hard as you try to make sure you do, everybody doesn't share that. There's some people that think that the deck's stacked against them.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, gentlemen, very much.
Councilor Taylor?
Thank you. Thank you. That was very interesting. I especially liked the part about history being important, the history of what's happened in the past. I'm a former teacher, and I know that knowing the history of education is really important. My question is, do you think that it would be better if police officers resided in the community in which they're policing?
I don't know how Chuck feels about that personally. I don't. I think it's important that they know the community that they're policing. And I think you can know a community without actually residing there. There's research both ways on on this issue. There's some research that would support officers living in the specific community that they police in. There are some programs to do that. There are some resident officer programs that are used around the country to incentivize officers to live in the neighborhoods or communities that they work in. There's also some research on the other side that would indicate, going back to the officer wellness and safety, that when officers are required to live where they work, they actually enter into this like hyper-vigilant state where they never feel like they can let their guard down, they never feel like they can relax. So just to give you some examples of things that have been documented, officers whose kids go to school with the kids of people that they've arrested. That's a cause of significant, not only potential problems with the school, but there's stress within the family. Officers that consistently run into people that they have interacted with as police officers in their off-duty time at the grocery store, at the movie theater, those kinds of things can create unnecessary stress and mental health issues. And so there's been some research on that shows that this hypervigilance actually can then lead to problems with them in the performance of their duties, because they never feel like they're off. They never feel like they can relax and have their guard down. So the jury's out in terms of science on that. But in my opinion, officers can get to know the communities that they work in very well without actually residing there. In Chicago, for instance, Chicago has a strict residency requirement for its police officers. They have to live in the city. And so do all city employees. The result of that has been, by my observation, significant segregated neighborhoods of city employees. And so there's a neighborhood on the south side near Midway Airport. I don't know what the airport magnet is, and there's a neighborhood on the northwest side near O'Hare Airport. And if you look at a map of the city, and we've done this in Chicago, and you mark the map by city employees, like 80% of city employees, 40% of them live near O'Hare Airport, 40% of them live in the neighborhood near Midway Airport, and the other 20% are kind of spread around, but they really bulk out. And then if you do police and fire, it's even a higher percentage. Just 90% is either in the northwestern neighborhood or the south side neighborhood.
I mean, and Sean's right. The jury's out on that. I came up through the Chicago PD, so I was very used to residency. But that city is very, very large. So I grew up on the south side of Chicago. My first assignment was on the west side of Chicago. I had to go by the street map to be able to find my way around, because I knew nothing about the west side at all. And cities can be quite different depending on what side of town you're on and what you're accustomed to. And there was an actual policy in place where you were not assigned to the district where you lived. Some of it had to do with, people knew you and you knew them, and you make arrests, and, it impacts your house, it impacts your kids, all that sort of stuff. Whether that's legitimate or not, I don't know. But I do know that they would intentionally send you someplace other than where you live. So it's not that easy. But I do believe that you can have police officers don't necessarily reside, but they can care deeply about the community that they serve. And that's really what you have to strive for. It shouldn't be about where they live, what color they are, what gender they are. It's their commitment to the service of the people that actually live in that community. And there are countless examples of where people are able to do that, irrespective of where they live. And there are other examples of people who may live in an area that may be a little tougher on folks in that neighborhood than they would be if they weren't. So, I mean, you could probably find outliers no matter what. Personally, I like residency. That's personally. But that's just me, a bias that I have. When I left Chicago and went to D.C., I could have lived in Maryland, could have lived in Virginia, because they had a 50-mile radius. I lived in the District of Columbia. When I came to Philadelphia, you could live as long as you stayed in a Commonwealth. I live in Philadelphia to this day. I live inside the city of Philadelphia. So that's me personally.
Thank you. I was reminded of that because of a person who used to be on the police commission here told me that some of the police did not understand the culture of Eugene because they lived in small towns, and that he thought it would be better if they lived in Eugene and associated with people there. But I can see the other side too. As a teacher, I didn't want to live next door to my students. But thank you.
Thank you. Councilor Evans.
Thank you, Mayor. I'm not quite sure how to encapsulate all of my comments in 3 minutes, but one thing I want to say, Sean and Commissioner Ramsey, thank you very much for the presentation. It's very thorough. It really gets to the heart of where I think we are going with 21st century policing, and Commissioner Ramsey, been a big fan of yours for a long time, so want to make that comment. In response to my colleague, Councilor Clark, perception for people of color is reality. And having lived in this community for 32 years, I will say this before I get into this particular comment, is that policing in Eugene has improved dramatically. When I came here in 1985, the first time I was ever stopped by a police officer was in the city of Eugene. And then I was stopped 43 times after that in the last 32 years. Not recently, but I had incidents, and I had to stop once when I was a passenger in a car. My wife was driving, who happens to be white. When the police officer came over, did not explain why he had stopped us, but had asked for my driver's license and my insurance. Went back. My wife was getting upset, getting hot about it. I said, be quiet. Don't say anything. You got to leave this alone. I know what this is. Run me back on airs, come back, gave me the license, gave me my insurance card, told us we could go on. She wanted to ask why we got stopped. I said, don't do that. Don't say anything. See, that's my reality. That's my reality. And that's the reality of a lot of other individuals of color in this community and other communities. But I will say that this department under Chief Kearns has improved dramatically. Now, are we where we need to be? I don't think so. But we're getting there. The question I have for you gentlemen is this, in the last 30 seconds that I have, is how do we get to a more robust and engaged partnership with our minority communities, communities of color, and other communities that have been marginalized? That's one. And two, training. And training is a big bugaboo for me. I may need a second round because training has, in my opinion, in terms of this area, has been lacking on the part of the state police force, who actually provides most of the diversity and equity training in this state. So, I'm out of time now, but I just wanted you to respond to those two issues.
Well, I mean, there's ways in which you can break down stereotypes that exist. Again, it gets back to biases that, everyone has. And being biased and being racist, that's not the same thing. I mean, we can have a bias about a lot of things that make you racist, and I think that's one of the important things to remember. But I'll use Philly as an example, because Philly's another big city. You get people that grew up in, let's say, the northeast part of the city, and they get signed out of the academy to West Philadelphia. It's almost like what I described my experience being in Chicago. Well, one of the things we started doing when I took over is every recruit that came out started the first 6 to 9 months on foot patrol in some of the most challenged communities that we have in the city. And believe me, Philly's got some challenged communities. And we're not talking about along business corridors and stuff like that. We're talking about places where there's drug trafficking, there's prostitution, there's gang activity, all these kinds of things. And they start off on foot patrol, signed, with a veteran officer, but foot patrol. So why that? Well, it does have an impact on crime, because we had a study with Temple University that showed a 22% decrease in areas where we had foot patrol. But the bigger and the more important lesson that I think police officers learn is that even in the most challenged neighborhoods, there are more decent, law-abiding people there than there are criminals. There are kids that just want to go to school and have a shot at life. And so you may not have been from that community, you may not have been exposed to that, and many of these are communities of color, because unfortunately there's a disproportionate amount of crime in many of those communities. It starts to change attitudes, because I think it starts with just knowing one another on a one-on-one basis. Just a very quick example. One of my deputy, who is now the commissioner of Philly, was out driving the street, and he sees a rookie cop, and he's on his smartphone, and there's this little girl standing near him. And so he stopped. His first assumption was that the cop was there playing with his cell phone and ignoring the young girl. So he got out of his car and said, "Hey, how you doing? What's going on?" Well, the young lady had walked up to him and asked him a question. He didn't know the answer to it, so he did a Google search on his smartphone to give her the answer. That never would have happened if he's sitting in a Crown Victoria driving down the street with his windows rolled up. But that interaction that he had with that one child, a young African-American child, it'll stay with her for probably the rest of her life. And it stayed with him, too. That kind of interaction, human being to human being, adult to child, those things can happen. But we have to have an environment or create a system that allows for those opportunities to take place. And that's really the key in creating a community policing environment, strategy, or whatever. How can we create an environment where these kinds of things can happen? It's not just making a traffic stop. It's not just making, those kind of high-stress situations for both the person that's being stopped as well as the cop that's doing the stopping and all those kinds of things, just a normal day-to-day interaction. So I'm a huge proponent, obviously, of community policing, but trying to create an environment where that opportunity can exist. Because when you sit in that car, and I'm telling you, and you listen to radio call after radio call, and it's rape here, robbery there, shooting there, all this kind of stuff, it can be a struggle not to become biased over time. So you have to fight that. And you have to expose yourself constantly to the positive side of what's going on. And there's not a community around that have positive things going on. People that want to improve quality of life, people that want to do the right thing. You got to create an opportunity where you get exposed to that too. So you don't get jaded. You don't get tainted. You don't start thinking everybody's a criminal. All kids, the kids standing on the corner, there's a bunch of gangbangers. No, that's the basketball team that just left practice and they're waiting to get a bus to go home. Because you know the kids. You know the kids. And so those are the kinds of things that create that opportunity for that sort of thing to happen. That's how you start, I think, building that kind of culture, that kind of environment where you break down a lot of those barriers. They're going to be there for a while, and legitimately so. I talked about history of policing. You look at policing through that historical lens, one thing is very clear. Police in this country have not always stood on the right side of justice as we would define justice today. It's just a fact. You got to recognize it and be able to move on. What they were doing may have been legal at the time, Jim Crow laws and all that sort of thing, but was it really morally right? Well, we look at it today and say, oh my God, no, it wasn't. But for the people who were trapped in that era, they were doing what they were paid to do. So it's not about making people into villains and evil and all this sort of thing, but it's understanding where people are coming from. We need to be able to see policing through the eyes of the people being policed. If we can accomplish that, then I think we've accomplished and we've really started to really make serious progress. We're moving forward.
I can't say anything after that. So. But thank you for sharing your story. Appreciate that.
Councilor Pryor.
Wow, where to begin?
Mayor, this is
Yep.
Mayor, this is Councilor Zlink. I've been on for a while. I don't need to be in the queue, but I just wanted to let you know I've been on for a while.
Okay, that's great. Do you want to be in the queue?
Not this time.
Okay.
Great. Just trying to absorb all the great stuff, and I always kind of think, well, how can I internalize and kind of react and think, what can I do differently as a public official, but also as a part of the city? And just two of the things that you talked about that leapt out for me. One of them has to do with, I guess, what I'll call the internal versus the external. And you talk about perceptions within the police department, expectations, and the expectation people have that there's integrity, consistency, fairness, respect, understanding, communication, loyalty, trust. That's what a public expects from its officers, and then the internal is that's what officers expect from their own organization. And that you can't really exhibit those characteristics in your interaction with the public if you don't have them within the organization. That was a huge takeaway for me. So what we need to do is to figure out ways to create. It's modeling the behavior. You create the environment that encourages and emphasizes those characteristics internally so we can then take them out into the community, and then vice versa. So for me, a real emphasis on both the internal and the external as mutually reinforcing aspects. Another one is what I'll call before and after. When I was working in public affairs, one of the things that we were very cognizant of was there's the incident, and then there's the reaction to that incident afterwards. And that the incident could be something that takes 30 seconds, and the reaction to it afterwards can take years. If the reaction is not handled appropriately. And I think that's kind of what you're talking about. If I'm an officer and I'm responding to an incident, and I resolve that incident in 5 minutes, but have I really dealt appropriately with the reaction to that incident that's going to occur after that? And so what training or effort or encouragement or thinking do we need to put into responding to a call that says you're not just responding to a call for an incident, you're responding to a call that's going to also have a reaction? And how can we as a city and as officers deal with the reaction that inevitably goes with every incident? Because if I'm just dealing with the incident and not what happens after that, then that's just left up to whatever chance is, and I'm having no participation in it. And so that then gets back to the last point, which was can do versus should do. I have the authority and I have the legal right to do this, but should I do it? And sometimes the outcome of that choice has not only an impact on the internal versus the external, but also on the before and the after. So you've really, particularly through your pillars, stimulated a lot of thinking about what we need to do. And I think that's a really good thing. But for me, we've had reports before that have good stuff in them. And I want to figure out what we can do tangibly to be able to implement that good stuff in an effective way.
Well, it's always a challenge in a report. Writing a report is the easy part. Implementing recommendations is the most difficult. And our challenge in putting together a report, there are 18,000 roughly police departments in the United States. How do you, at local, federal, state level, how do you write a report where everybody can get a nugget or two and see that it really applies? That's hard to do, especially in a compressed time frame. So we weren't as specific in some areas as we would like to be, but I think we were not so general that people couldn't come up with some real solid action steps. In fact, the report contains, I think it's 59 recommendations and 92 action steps. So if you, that particular recommendation, here's some things you could put in place. But to kind of get at some of your questions, internal procedural justice, some of the community may not realize this, but those of us that are in the business, I think do. And again, this isn't a comment about Eugene, it's about policing in general. Police departments tend to be very punishment driven. You commit this infraction, then this is the penalty. A day's suspension, 2 days, 10 days, whatever it might be. We're not talking about major violations of policy or criminal actions here. Most things fall within the minor category, okay? 2, 3, 4, 5 days or less in terms of a suspension. But if the goal is to change behavior, is suspension always the best option? And I would argue, maybe not. If you want to change the behavior of an individual, is suspending them for 5 days, taking money away from them for 5 days, does it create bitterness or does it really change behavior? Now, we're not talking about what we call frequent flyers, the ones that are always screwing up. We're talking about people that make an honest mistake or make a mistake in judgment that you want to correct, but at the same time, you want to be careful as how you do it. So I think we need to rethink the disciplinary process. Those people that require that, we need to be relentless in going after them, quite frankly, because they ruin the reputation of an entire city, department, and profession. And we need to weed them out. But most of the stuff that we deal with is relatively small. So we need to think about that, because how we treat them impacts how they then turn around and treat other people. So, I think that's important.
And there are some other models like education-based discipline and some other things that other police departments around the country are using. So to kind of deal with what Chuck is talking about. The other thing I would just bring to your attention is that I think we're going to continue working with your executive staff, and I think you'll have some opportunities to do some implementation of recommendations and action items maybe coming into next year. So,
yeah, we have to build on these things and really come up with a plan to continue to push forward. And then that's the challenge, and it's always the challenge. This wasn't designed or meant to be something that's going to, survive, decades of of review and study and so forth. It's got to stay fresh. It's a living document. We grow, we learn, we change, we adapt. And policing is a tough nut. I mean, police don't change that often, and usually it's a crisis or some issue that makes them change. But I'm very pleased to know that many departments around the country are looking at these records, taking them seriously, and really putting in place some changes that need to be made.
Thank you. I'm just watching the clock. I have Councilor Ye hasn't had a chance yet. Councilor Evans, you wanted a second round. Are you okay? So if we can just go for just a few more minutes, we'll let Councilor Ye.
I'll be fast. Your story about the young girl that you were telling made me think of a conversation I had recently with one of our school resource officers, and he was telling me how his job basically consists of going from one negative interaction to another, trying to put out fires in his area, and how he really wished he had time. He specifically wished he had time to spend in the elementary schools having positive interactions with kids, but you guys mentioned that it was more important to spend time with older kids, and I'm wondering if you guys talked about that much, like what age group to put your resources in.
No, we did, and I think I was speaking more to give you an example.
Okay.
But actually, we talk about in the task force report engaging with youth at every age. And one of the programs that I've talked about a lot, and I've talked about it last night, in fact, here, is kind of modeled after what the fire department does. I don't know if you're familiar with, they actually have a national program. And what they do is they visit a child's class at kindergarten, in some communities even preschool. The whole idea behind the fire service program is to familiarize children with the way firemen look when they're fully engaged in fighting a fire, because there have been a number of tragedies over the years where children saw a fireman in their house which was on fire and they looked scary, and so they hid, and unfortunately the children died. And so, those of you who have kids or nieces and nephews would know that every kindergarten class gets visited by a firefighter. And every third grade class gets visited again by a firefighter. And there's usually sometime between kindergarten and fifth grade a field trip to the firehouse. And police just haven't really done that. And so what a number of communities are doing is adopting a similar program where police officers will visit a kindergarten class dressed in their regular street clothing, and talk to the class and kind of get familiar with the kids, and then let him know that his job is a police officer, which some of them don't really realize what that is. And then he'll excuse himself and say, I'll be right back. And he'll go out and he'll change into his police uniform and then come back in the room. And kind of familiarize the kids with what a police officer looks like in uniform, and explain to them that, hey, if you're lost, you can come to someone that looks like me, that's wearing this badge, that's in this uniform. If there's somebody's hurting you, you can come to me and talk to me about that. You can come to somebody in this uniform and talk to us about that. And just kind of break that ice at a very young age, and then follow up again in about third grade, and then again either fifth or sixth grade. And usually by that time, they'll be in a school that has a school resource officer, or headed towards a high school that has a resource officer. But by then, the last thing you want is unfortunately what a majority of places in a majority of communities occurs. A person's very first interaction with a police officer in their life will occur either when the police officer's coming to their house because mom and dad are fighting, or to arrest mom or dad, or when they get pulled over. And that's not the first time that you want an introduction to that profession. So, I apologize if I gave you the wrong impression, but we talk about early and often engagement with youth in particular.
Younger the better.
Yep.
I want to thank you both again for this work, which I really think is incredibly helpful to us as a community, and certainly as a council as we think about this. I feel excited and kind of eager to do the next step. So thank you very much for bringing your expertise and insights to our table, and we appreciate it. And I think with that, we are adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.